Well, welcome to the Entangled Traditions panel, which I think is going to be very exciting. And first of all, Byron Hamann is going to talk about Las Relaciones Mediterratlánticas, comparative archaeologies in the Relaciones Topográficas and the Relaciones Geográficas from Castile and Spanish America, respectively. Thank you, Byron.
Well, again, thank you to Ben and Felipe for organizing this. It's been tons of fun already, so I'm very happy to be here. In a now famous essay from 1997, Sanjay Subramaniam argued that apocalypticism, the widespread belief among Muslim Jews and Christians alike that the last days were at hand, offered a powerful framework for writing connected histories of early modern Eurasia. Today, I explore an alternative connected history theme, the intersection of European and Amerindian antiquarianism in the early modern Mediterranean. A recurring motif in histories of Renaissance Europe is what Jakob Burckhardt called the revival of antiquity, a renewed engagement with the detritus of the ancient world. 15th century Italian innovations inspired similar engagements throughout the lands north of the Mediterranean. Surveys of ancient monuments, compilations of ancient inscriptions, physical collections of ancient stones. At the same time, however, this renewed scholarly fascination coexisted with a more mundane, everyday antiquarianism, the archaeological awareness of farmers and villagers accustomed to living in a landscape sedimented with the remains of earlier occupations. Europeans brought these sensibilities with them to the Americas, these antiquarian sensibilities with them to the Americas, and so were often attentive to the ruins and remains they found there. But they did not simply stumble across antiquities. They discovered that indigenous people had already developed their own traditions of archaeological interpretation. In other words, Europeans in the Americas encountered not only ancient artifacts, but antiquarian interlocutors as well. Now, although the antiquarian ideas, both scholarly and everyday, developed by early modern Italians and Spaniards, for example, were contemporary with the antiquarian ideas developed by early modern Aztecs and Incas, for example, these coeval traditions of archaeological interpretation have seldom been brought into dialogue. On the one hand, we have a massive literature on Renaissance antiquarianism in Italy, complemented by a more modest list of publications on Spain, say, and the Germanies. And then on the other, we have an even smaller bibliography about indigenous archaeologies in the Americas. Now, this allochronic treatment of Amerindian and European antiquarian traditions is very curious because dialogues between these antiquarianisms were already taking place and being recorded in the 16th century. Now, although a few pre-Hispanic texts about the meanings of ruins survive from Mesoamerica, enhanced by archaeological findings from both Mesoamerica and the Andes, most of what we know about indigenous archaeological traditions is preserved in alphabetic texts written after 1492, often by European authors. In other words, the bulk of our archive about indigenous traditions of archaeology was written down in part because it was a topic that Europeans were already interested in. Far from being what Pierre Bourdieu and Michel-Rolph Trio have theorized as the unthinkable, American ruins were, for early modern Europeans, eminently good to think. Now, as it happens, an amazing set of documents survives that enables us to undertake this Mediterranean comparison of archaeological traditions. And in overlapping chronological order, these are Ambrosio de Morales' 4 books on Iberian history, 1575 to 1586, the Relaciones Topográficas, town surveys from central Castile, 1575 and 1581, and then the Relaciones Geográficas, town surveys of Spanish America, 1577 to 1586. One was published, the other 2 remained as manuscripts, 2 inventoried Iberia, and 1 focused on the Americas. All 3 were the product of epistolary knowledge. That is, all were generated from reports written down on paper, mailed across hundreds or thousands of miles, and then combined with other reports to form a composite whole. Finally, all 3 surveys, this is why I'm bringing them together, shared an interest in archaeological documentation. All described ruined cities, all included transcriptions of ancient texts written in alien scripts. Now, unfortunately, I don't have time to talk about Mr. Morales today, so I'm focusing on the two Relaciones projects. The Relaciones Geográficas from Spanish America is probably the best known of these three projects. In 1577, and then again in 1584, 50-item questionnaires were printed in Iberia and shipped across the Atlantic. Over the course of the next decade, replies slowly were shipped back to Seville, and in all, 208 of these responses survive today. Now, the 50-item questionnaire shipped to Spanish America had a complicated backstory. The lists of questions were based on a similar project of epistolary knowledge undertaken within Iberia, and this is the Relaciones Topográficas project. In 1575, and then again in 1578, 57 and then 45-item questionnaires were printed and circulated throughout central Castile, and today 721 of these survive. Now, the two projects are clearly connected. Although their lists of questions are not identical, they share the basic thematic contours across the entire set of questions, and in many cases, the phrasing of the American surveys is copied word for word from the Iberian surveys, so they're very closely connected projects, in addition to being basically simultaneous. However, the lists of questions that are circulated are not always a reliable guide to the riches of, that respondents offered up for King Philip II. In both 1575 and 1578, respondents in Iberia were asked to provide descriptions of ancient remains, ancient buildings, epitaphs, inscriptions, antiquities. Now, surprisingly, this is not one of the questions that was then copied over to the list of questions for Spanish America. But this apparent difference is misleading. Now, if we look at the answers generated on both sides of the Atlantic, a very different picture emerges. Many of the responses prepared for the Americas, in fact, include detailed archaeological descriptions, a testament to the importance of everyday antiquarianism for both Iberians and Native Americans. Now, I've now spoken, actually I'm behind, I've spoken for 8 minutes and 44 seconds, but in my remaining time, I want to sketch out five points of comparison in these two projects of epistolary archaeology. Number one, the foundations of everyday archaeology, houses and abandoned towns. Now, one striking feature of archaeological replies in the Relaciones from both sides of the Atlantic is their careful attention to questions of facture and materiality. That is, how objects and buildings are made and what they have been made from. Now, as anthropological and art historical studies over the past 2 decades have made clear, these properties were clearly very important from Native American perspectives, and Steve gave us a great example of Andean materiality just a few minutes ago. But in order to understand how it was that Iberian surveyors were attentive to these details of facture and materiality as well in the New World, in spite of the absence of a specific question on antiquarian remains in the New World surveys, we need to consider 2 broad Iberian foundations for everyday antiquarianism. And these are, as you can see, techniques of house construction and the omnipresence of abandoned towns. Now, tellingly, a question about how local houses were built and where their construction supplies came from were included in the lists for both sides of the Atlantic. And in what follows, red will be for the Iberian project and blue will be for the New World project. Now, throughout the early modern world, the houses of ordinary people were dependent on whatever construction materials were available nearby. Iberian answers to this question make clear the gripping poverty of rural Castile. Many towns actually had no local building supplies and so had to get their building materials from elsewhere. So materials are required beyond the town limits. There's no plaster or lime at all. And of course, plaster-based construction is super important in Iberia. Now, in contrast, this problem of local building materials is seldom, if ever, mentioned for the Americas, where local material plenitude is often noted. So, a place, there's plenty of white stone for construction, lots of plaster and lime. Now, another transatlantically shared pair of questions reveals an awareness of how fragile early modern urban existence was. And these questions ask about abandoned towns. The Iberian answers to this question are often strikingly attentive to sedimented time. They make clear that the landscape of central Castile was filled with broken buildings and depopulated settlements. In many cases, it was remembered that plagues depopulated recently abandoned towns. Now, in other cases, unusual features of architecture or artifacts led locals to attribute the ruins to more ancient inhabitants. So assumed to be Moorish houses because they were so old. From the anatomy, it appears to be an ancient house of the Templars. Now, the recognized fragility of town life in central Castile is one reason why the American surveys also asked about, quote, the locations of abandoned Spanish towns in the Americas. It's striking, however, that no direct question about the depopulation of indigenous towns appears in the American questionnaire. Plague depopulations in the Americas were, of course, even more devastating than they were in contemporary Europe. Some of them questions do mention plagues, however, and some Peruvian responses link abandoned indigenous towns to Spanish policies of forced resettlement. Occasionally, abandoned towns in the Americas are, as in Iberia, offered as evidence of a long-occupied landscape. So from Yucatan, this land appears to have been well populated. There's not a handful of earth that doesn't have evidence of former occupations. So, house construction techniques and abandoned towns. In the printed Relaciones questionnaires, these two issues are kept separate. But in lived experience, these two seemingly separated topics provided a practical foundation for everyday archaeology. Many of the men responding to the Relaciones combined these two concerns when they described in detail the unusual masonry and materials of abandoned or repurposed buildings. In other words, an awareness of how much effort it took to construct houses in the present was used in turn to turn a critical eye towards construction methods preserved in ruined buildings. And this brings us to the second part, the aesthetics of masonry. Now, in many cases, this architectural antiquarian vision had a very practical foundation. Ancient buildings and building materials were often repurposed to new uses. So, a chapel to Mary Magdalene, which was once a Moorish mosque, etc., for central Iberia. But in other examples, the description of ancient Iberian construction details seems to have been undertaken for its own sake, in sheer appreciation of the labor that had endured the ravages of time. So, from Pueblo de Montalban by Toledo, all of its stones from the foundation of the dome above are worked very curiously and fit one to the other so well that it does not use mortar or any other material beyond locking some stones to others. And there's other examples of this engagement with the specificity of how masonry is put together in Iberia. Now, in turn, these Castilian examples of everyday archaeological awareness illuminate the surprisingly detailed descriptions of ruined monumental architecture we see in the American surveys. The stonework in the palaces of Mitla, 1300 to 1500, or the courtyards of Tiwanaku, 400 to 1000, is truly stunning even today. But when reading Spanish accounts of these places in the American surveys, we should remember that these descriptions were partially made possible because an aesthetics of ancient masonry was already part of how early modern Iberians viewed their world. The description of stonework at Tiwanaku and Mitla has a surprising kinship with the description of stonework from Pueblo de Montalban, which I just read for you. So this is in our Tiwanaku being made of very large stones, and in the working and laying of them, there's found no mixture of mortar, nor sand, nor clay, and they are so fitted and well laid that one cannot even insert in their joints the point of a knife. And again, this very parallel to what I just read from Toledo, but again, for Mitla, the joins and fitting of these stones is of one stone on another without any mix of mortar or any other substance. So very parallel forms of describing masonry on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, these descriptions of pre-Hispanic ruins are interesting not simply because of how much they echo the materially detailed descriptions of ruined buildings in central Castile. Over and over again, the New World reports make clear that accounts of ruins in the Americas were informed by indigenous knowledge about what those ruins meant and what they had been used for in the past. In many cases, the names of indigenous experts are included at the beginning or the end of a town's relación. In other words, because daily life in Iberia produced an everyday archaeological sensitivity in many people, a sensitivity not limited to antiquarian scholars, when European observers arrived in the Americas, they were often receptive to hearing and recording indigenous archaeological knowledge. Just some examples. So, Teotihuacan, which they called the Hill of the Moon, and An example from, this is a Wari site. The old Indians say that according to what they have heard from their ancestors, and some Indians remember having seen. So again, pointing to, it's not just Europeans writing these, they're interacting with local knowledge. And here's an example from Yucatan as well. The natives say that of the sub-building, etc. 3, manufactured gods. Now, a further parallel theme is provided by the repeatedly materialist accounts of sacred images. Again and again, writers filling out these questionnaires took time to describe local images of divine beings, and their accounts reveal a sustained fascination with what those images were made from. Although this is mostly limited to non-Christian images. We learn the names of local Iberian saints and hear about their chapels, but there's actually very little ekphrastic description of Catholic sacred images in these texts other than their names, and perhaps this is a response to Protestant critiques of Catholic materialist idolatry. In contrast, no such material reservations were needed when accounting for pagan images. As with accounts of ancient architecture, accounts of Roman and pre-Roman statues in central Castile can be quite evocative. So, 2 hogs carved from granite, Hercules of admirable facture, small, very well gilded, it was of copper. This materialist tendency is also found in accounts of indigenous god images in the Americas. The dismissal of non-Catholic divinities as nothing more than crude physicality is well illustrated by the stereotyped description of such images from central Mexico to Oaxaca to New Granada to Peru as, quote, idols of stones and sticks. But the Catholic rejection of sacred materiality is only part of the story told by the American Relaciones. In other cases in the Americas, it's clear that European reporters are describing vanished indigenous images that they had personally never actually seen. So in other words, in these cases, information on the appearance of ancient sculptures must have been provided by Native American interlocutors, people for whom those images had once been sacred, and the physical properties of which were important features of their sacred power. In other words, physical descriptions that for Europeans provided proof of pagan powerlessness were, for the indigenous people providing those accounts, evidence of intrinsic value. And so from Venezuela, the idols, quote unquote, out of cotton string, deity that's a black knife of obsidian from Oaxaca, statue made from wood in the shape of a man, which was inlaid with rich stones. Moving along, part 4, Escrituras Antiguas, Pinturas Antiguas. A fourth point of comparison in our Mediterranean archive of Relaciones has to do with textual materiality. Many of the Relaciones from central Castile make reference to, and even quote from, ancient writings, Escrituras Antiguas, from the town's past, often taken from the town's archive. Town foundation charters were especially important and often mentioned. As was common throughout medieval and early modern Europe, the physical properties of those texts were often important guarantees of their authenticity, and so these physical details are duly noted in the Relaciones responses. So, written on parchment, gold and lead sealed, written in large capitals, red, and on parchment, these letters, etc. Now, respondents were also interested in more ancient texts, especially stone inscriptions from the Muslim or Roman past. These accounts are often very attentive to material details. What kind of stone is it? How are the letters cut? And in some cases, the Relacion respondent even transcribes the ancient Latin inscriptions into the document. So here's one example, and then here's another of a Roman inscription directly copied into the document. Now, if we move with this theme of ancient writing from central Castile to the Spanish Americas, the first thing that becomes clear is why so many writers of the American responses were interested in the town foundation histories recorded in indigenous texts. Town foundation charters, as we just heard, written in Escrituras Antiguas, ancient writings, were of great importance in early modern Iberian responses to the Relaciones Topográficas as well. So, for example, the Relacion of Coatepec mentions the use of ancient paintings to uncover that indigenous town's foundation history. And we also have foundation history texts, for example, in Yucatan, according to what the Indians say, and as it appears in their histories. And again, who told and declared this, it is said, by means of their paintings. So again, this interest in textual archives on both sides of the Atlantic. Perhaps because early modern Iberians knew that the validity of their own town foundation documents often depended on their unusual properties, parchment, colored letters, pendant seals. They also recorded the physical properties of textual documentation in the New World. So Maya hieroglyphs, they had letters in which they wrote and were understood. Even quipus are described from one of the Andean systems, the quipus which the Inca dispatched, which were not in chords. So again, interest in these material details of textuality. Of course, European interests are not the only factor here, and they also have their limits. The most detailed accounts of indigenous writing systems in the American surveys were clearly dependent on input from indigenous people. Gaspar Antonio Chi, a Mayan nobleman, signed his name as co-author for the Relación from Mérida in the Yucatan. No less than 9 indigenous Andean elites are named as advisors at the beginning of the quipu mentioning Relación of la Concepción. So, our Mediterranean Survey of Relaciones projects from 1575 to 1586 has ranged from houses in abandoned towns, striking architectural forms, forcefully material images of the gods, and a textual archive manifested in parchment, seals, stones, and alien scripts. And actually, I'm just skipping ahead. Also, as in Iberia, we often have these Native American documents literally copied into the Relación. So here's a calendar diagram. Of course, many of you know the famous maps, town maps of the Relaciones Geográficas from New Spain. And here's even a genealogy copied into one of the Relaciones from what is now Guatemala. So we've surveyed these various examples. I've argued that everyday archaeology in Iberia made it possible for Europeans in the Americas to literally see and want to describe indigenous antiquities with some care, as well as be interested in what those antiquities meant to native peoples. But of course, the past is rarely ever dead and buried and tranquil. The meaning of the past and its implications for the present can be a source of conflict. So in conclusion, let us turn to the Relaciones and consider archaeologies at war in the early modern Mediterranean. Now, in Iberia, for local guardians of antiquities, the interests of outsiders could be viewed with caution. A response to the Relación Topográfica from Maqueda, Toledo, copies a Roman inscription, which you see here, and then notes that the stone had very recently been moved to safety inside the town's local hermitage building, because there were fear that outside antiquarians would take it away. The document is very explicit about this. Back to the question of sort of looting and appropriation power. Now, this is not to say that ancient remains were valued equally by all of the inhabitants of any given village in central Castile. At least one Relación writer answers question 36 by complaining about the lack of local interest in the town's material heritage, because the villagers are farm workers, they have not valued these and have not protected them. Again, talking about ancient Roman antiquities. Varied local attitudes to the remains of the past and the potential rapaciousness of outsiders are perhaps best illustrated in the Relación Geográfica from Quillotepec in Oaxaca, in what's now Mexico. In the Americas, of course, the main danger to local relics was not theft by collectors or disinterest, but destruction by Catholics. And just going to read this passage and then comment on it. And when the Franciscan fathers had just arrived, wanting to sow the faith, they determined to bring out and find the idols in order to burn them and to break them. And having collected all that there were, some Indians, truly converted, who did not wish anything to be hidden, revealed to the said fathers that they had hidden a book which they held for God, which they had held in great veneration, because a white man, elderly, the Quetzalcoatl, had written the whole thing, and, leaving, he left it behind, either forgotten or so that they should guard it. The Franciscan father ordered that it be brought out, and, not understanding the writing, nor how to read it, he burned it with the idols. It was of white paper and of this size, so in other words, about the same size as the piece of paper on which the Relación respondent was writing, bound and tied with some ribbons, again, all this wonderful materiality of writing detail, and in it they worshipped their gods. Now, here's how I interpret this passage. At first, the friars believed that they had collected all that there were. But if false compliance was the original strategy of Quillotepec indigenous traditionalists, those traditionalists were betrayed. For, quote, some Indians, truly converted, felt that the tendered images were not a sufficient offering, and so surrendered to destruction a sacred book that traditionalists had tried to hide and save. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Byron. So Giuseppe Marcocci is going to talk to us about the invention of antiquities, Annius of Viterbo and Motolinia, and the Indians of New Spain. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I would like to thank Ben and Felipe for inviting me from the Mediterranean across the Atlantic to come here, and I wish to thank also the Joukowsky Institute and the JCB for inviting me. I spent 2 wonderful months this spring at the JCB as a fellow working on a project on writing word histories in the Renaissance. I am an historian, I have to say this, and my entrance in antiquarianism is from this perspective. This paper, the paper I'm going to present today, is an exercise of exploration of some possible entanglements between indigenous and colonial antiquarian traditions, which came together for some time after the Spanish conquest of Anahuac, contributing to the emergence of a peculiar interest in the past of what was soon called New Spain. Religion had a special place in this process. The archaeological excavations carried out in Mexico City as part of the Proyecto Templo Mayor show how religious life encouraged an antiquarian interest among the Mexicas. This is confirmed by the ritual burial of votive objects from periods as remote as the mid-preclassic age, corresponding to Olmec culture. They were regarded as particularly valuable for their antiquity and rarity, but also because they came from places connected with deities or powerful admired groups. But what happened to these antiquarian traditions immediately after the conquest? The question involves the reactions to the campaign of destruction of buildings, monuments, and objects that the Spaniards regarded as symbols of the political and religious order of Mexico before the conquest. Since colonizers and colonized knew nothing of each other, conquest and destruction created a terrible break for those who later tried to recover some knowledge of a world that was close in time but now lost forever. Renaissance antiquarianism, which was taking its first step in Europe, but stimulated intense interest in pre-Columbian Mexico and its objects, which found their way into European collections and museums, and at a later stage were at the center of the development of sophisticated strategies by Creole elites in New Spain. It all began with the application of the humanist idea of antiquity shaped for the Greco-Roman world to the unknown universe whose existence was abruptly interrupted by Hernan Cortés. We may wonder if and how the Nahua antiquarian traditions interacted with this process. This means giving a tentative answer to 3 questions which are at the core of my paper. First, did the Spaniards detect those traditions, the antiquarian traditions, that pre-Columbian antiquarian traditions? Did the Nahuas draw on them facing the arrival of the Spaniards? And finally, if the Spaniards collected and discussed relics of pre-Columbian Mexico also in order to distinguish its different ages, the different ages of pre-Columbian Mexico, how did they react to the Nahua materials related to those relics? An inevitable starting point is the literature produced by the first Franciscan missionaries in Mexico from the 1520s onward. Their writings show an antiquarian interest in the origin of Mexican peoples, genealogical lineages, the foundation of cities, the ruins of buildings and monuments, votive objects, and above all, pictographic codices, which in Europe were long seen as evocative objects to be collected rather than a tangible medium of forms of expression to be deciphered. The first who regarded the material traces of pre-Columbian Mexicos as antiquities, whether objects, ruins, or rites, were the Franciscan Andrés de Olmos and Toribio de Benavente, known as Motholinia, authors of writings that are now lost or survive only fragmentarily or in late problematic copies. But friars and their first readers describe those writings, the writings they wrote, as book of antiquities. They reinterpreted the fragments of the Mexican past, describing and organizing the materials in accordance with largely European schemas, thus inventing the successful branding of the antiquities of the Indians of New Spain. We must keep in mind this while considering that Motolinia's writing, the sources on which I'm going to focus on, are the outcome of a constant interaction with local informants and materials. So they are very ambiguous. A first point we need to make, general point, is that the drafts that are available, a fragment of 1528, a hastily concluded version of 1541 that had to be sent to the Count of Benavente, and later stratifications, reveal Motolinia's increasing interest in the description of the antiquities of New Spain, as well as of Nahua antiquarian traditions. One first example concerns problems of dating. Since 1528, Motolinia had been faced with a lack of evidence for Mexico being inhabited earlier than 8 centuries before. In the early drafts of his rappers, he attributes this limitation to the lack of writings, as he classifies the pictographic codices, which in an attempt to equate them with the annals of European traditions, he described as books of figures and characters. However, in a not much later version, he also referred to the lack of sculpted stones earlier than 800 years ago. The attention to material evidence is decisive here and is echoed in the illustrated manuscript from the late 16th century attributed to the mestizo Jesuit Juan de Tovar, a copy is here at the JCB, where he discusses the origins and successions of the Mexican peoples on the basis of ruins and traces still visible on their migration routes. Motolinia also mentions the remains of the Tenochtitlan secular buildings, which lead him to exclaim that, I quote, the Mexicans in this land were like the Romans in other times. However, his description is much more detailed when he moves on to the Teocalli, the Mesoamerican pyramids surmounted by a temple, admiring their size and number, paradoxically, if we think that the missionaries were actively contributing to their destruction, and recording them for, I quote, those who reach this land in future, as memory of them is now almost disappearing. A case in point is the description of the pyramid of Cholula, alongside the concern to complete the Spanish campaign against what Motolinia and the early missionaries called idolatry. There emerged a special interest in the monument. After giving its measurements, recalling that the structure was, I quote, much higher than now appears, Motolinia observes enthusiastically, this building really deserves to be seen even now, inhabited as it is by rabbits and vipers. He also emphasized that the Cholultecas had placed on the summit, I quote, a small ancient temple, something the Spaniards were aware of when in 1535, in Motolinia's presence, they destroyed it. Then, excavating its foundations, they found many idols buried there. It was precisely Motolinia's interest in what he called idols that allowed him to sense the importance the Nahuas gave to the ancient votive objects. consider his description of the festival in Tlaxcala in honor of the god Camaxtli, the god of war, also identified with Mixcoatl, represented by a great statue next to which was placed, I quote, a small, terrifying idol, which they said had come with those who had populated the land and province of Tlaxcala in the past, and they felt such reverence and fear that they dared not look at it. They also placed it over the statue of Camaxtli, I still quote, a mask which they said came with the small idol from a town called Tolan and from another called Poyatlan, from which they said came the idol itself. It seems that the Tlaxcalteca, who were allies of the Spaniards at the time of the conquest, attributed to these ancient votive objects a capacity to forge bonds with their ancestors. Motolinia lived in Tlaxcala in the second half of the 1530s and could investigate in depth local memories, traditions, and customs. And so, as well as the idol and the mask, he tells us that the Tlaxcaltecas, I quote, kept as precious relics 2 arrows brought by their ancestors from the lands of the Northeast and used them, I quote, as the main sign for knowing if they would win a battle or if they should withdraw in time. Motolinia makes his description more effective by a biblical comparison with Joseph's cup, which the Egyptian thought contained the art of warfare. This last passage was a quotation. In later drafts of Motolinia's writings, alongside, I quote, the shields and coats of arms of some lords of these earths, and the cacao seeds, materials, and other objects used as coins, is Motolinia who classifies them in this way. Motolinia allows himself more and more space for the votive objects the missionaries sought out, almost like modern archaeologists, following a paradoxical dynamic, of course, like that Carlo Ginzburg describes in his famous essay on the Inquisitor as anthropologist. When the Spanish campaign against idolatry erupted, writes Motolinia, the Nahuas resisted, hiding underground statuettes of the deities with their ancestries or entrusting them to a limited circle of custodians who protected them in secret. The result was that, I quote, if in 100 years' time the ancient patios were dug up, many idols would be found. Therefore, between 1539 and 1540, a start had been made, I quote again, on digging up the land, disinterring the dead, and regarding the Indians who handed in their idols. And in some parts, they searched for all those that had been forgotten and had been ruined underground. Now, Motolinia explains the deterioration of votive objects just by their being forgotten underground, ignoring the use of ritual burials, and so the possibility that those votive objects were ruined because they were more ancient and were handed over last of all to the missionaries as they were regarded as the most valuable. If that is so, then the practice of some Nahuas recorded by Motolinia would acquire another meaning. He says that they made copies of votive objects which they handed over the Spaniards. We know from, for example, Alessandro Russo's work that the Mexican objects Cortés sent to Europe soon after the conquest, some of which ended up in antiquarian collections, did not belong to pre-Columbian periods, but were produced on request of the Spaniards by local artisans in that very moment. This blurs the distinction between indigenous and colonial objects. But if we follow Motolinia, forging or copying votive objects is an act that would make it possible to deceive the missionaries, protecting the most ancient and valuable objects. Motolinia gives us another glimpse of deception and Mexican antiquarian traditions that the arrival of Spaniards might have stimulated. Even before Cortés disembarked, he tells, Moctezuma had received, I quote, a case of Spanish clothes that must have been from some ship that crossed the North Sea, inside which they found a sword, some rings, and other jewels and clothes. Whether the episode is true or not, the reaction attributed to Moctezuma is worth recalling, and I quote, he gave some jewels to the lords of Texcoco and Tlacuba, and to keep them quiet, told them that their ancestor had left them hidden and well protected, and that they should keep them most reverently. Motolinia's writing seemed to confirm the close relation between antiquarianism and religion pointed out by Momigliano. His famous essay, Ancient History and Antiquarian, recalls, for instance, the reprints of the images of the gods of the ancient by Vincenzo Cartari, taken from marbles, bronzes, and metals. A new edition appeared in 1615, together with a discourse on the gods of the East and West Indies with their figures, the work of the antiquarian Lorenzo Pignoria. Referring to the debates on Bible geography, Pignoria conjectures that the religion of the Mexicans derived from the ancient Egyptians, and therefore, I quote, the peoples of this part of the world conformed themselves in fashioning their idols to the images of Egyptian gods. The idea of an Egyptian origin for religions derived from the Dominican Agnus of Viterbo, a forger who in late 15th century twisted philology and humanist antiquarianism to invent an alternative antiquity that preceded that of the Greeks and Romans, one which also filled in some gaps in the Bible. In 1498, he published a collection of fake ancient texts that he claimed to have come across. Before that, he had already forged stones and inscriptions in support of his thesis of a distant foundation of his native city, Viterbo, in order to make it the center of the most ancient wisdom in Renaissance Italy. Pignoria is linked, a possible link, there are a number in my opinion, to Motolinia by the Codex Rios, a pictographic codex deriving from another one realized in mid-16th century Tehuan Valley by order of a Dominican friar who claims to have asked native artisans to reproduce in it pre-Columbian glyphs. This codex, from which Pignoria copied at least one Mexican image related to what is called Genesis, also contained a reference to the existence of giants in ancient Mexico, an idea supported by Motolinia, confirming the existence of their bones. It is this thin trace of a tradition that, reworked and distorted, led to the legend of the giant sons of Itztac Mixcoatl, which is also recorded in modern dictionaries of Nahua mythology. This tradition originates from Motolinia, who was influenced by Agnes' incredible genealogies with their vortex of invented etymologies that established explanatory links between names of localities and their alleged founders. Agnes' extraordinary success in the Renaissance depended on the possibility of inventing traditions provided in particular by the Antiquitates, as he translates the antiquities attributed to the Chaldean priest Berosus. This fake work claims that Noah was a giant and that the whole of humanity derived from his sons, whose descendants had repopulated the world after the great flood, leaving unequivocal signs in the names of the lands they had inhabited and the peoples to whom they had given origin. Being so flexible and adaptable, this model went on returning, sometimes implicitly, as in the case of Motolinia dealing with the Nahua's antiquarian traditions. The encounter between Agnos and Mexico came early, and set off a debate in which also Las Casas, for instance, among others, intervened. Motolinia must have been fascinated by it when he was preparing his report for the Count of Benavente in 1541, because we found the evidence I'm going to present you in this version, but not in the earlier one. And in the mid, we have the emergence of Años as an author, which is discussed by Oviedo first and other people. To present the slippery Mexican material to his Spanish readers, he recast it in a schema that was familiar to them. The popularity of Años in this year in Spain is huge. And so, colonial antiquarianism was vitiated from the start by the shadow of a forger. Motolinia hides the deception in the first pages, where he discusses the waves of migratory peoples who inhabited Mexico before the conquest. In so doing, he reacted to the contact with a today lost pictographic codex, keeping some memory of the pre-Columbian ages. For Motolinia, it was a relic of the past, on which to leave the last word to the interpretations of the old Indios. One of these is the basis for one of these Indios is the basis for a story he tells that is presented as an indigenous tradition, but is actually an attempt to channel fragments of an inaccessible past in an organic design that makes sense of the ruins and the relics of ancient Mexico that Motolinia is trying also to date, to understand. It is the legend of the common ancestors of the Indians of New Spain, identified in a later draft precisely with Itztac-Mixcoatl, whose divine nature goes unmentioned in the page of Motolinia, in the interest of emphasizing that from him proceed, I quote, great generations, almost as one reads of the son of Noah. The traces of Años' influence become still more evident when we read that Itztac-Mixcoatl's sons were scattered across Mexico, founding cities and giving rise to new peoples. In the three cases their name is given, a correspondence between Nahuatl etymologies that are working, of course, but not in these legends, and Años' genealogical techniques is suggested somehow. I give you three passages. From the second son, Tenoch, came the Tenochca, who are the Mexicans, and so Mexico City is called Tenochtitlan. From the fifth son, Mixtecatl, came the Mixteca. Their land is now called Mixtecapan. The last son gave rise to the Otomi, so called from his name Otomitl. This is the typical technique of Años and is reusing Mexican materials, of course, because there are a lot of etymologies also in explaining the foundation of Mexican cities, etc., but not in this way. And very interestingly, these are the names of the giants recorded in modern dictionaries of Nahua mythology. There are additions to the legend in the later version, but it allows Motolinia to provide his potential readers with an access key to the obscure Mexican antiquities. The underground action of Años' forgeries also works for Mexican idols, of course, in Motolinia's perspectives. Motolinia, for instance, claims that they too derived from the invention of idolatry by Ninus, king of the Assyrians and founder of Nineveh, repeating almost word for word a passage in Berrozo's Antiquities. To conclude, I think that we need to rethink the whole of Motolinia's contribution to the birth of a new antiquarianism in colonial Mexico in the light of his complex dependence on Mexican materials, but also on Años of Viterbo. For the moment, a general observation, also thinking to the previous examples I provided you with, may be enough to conclude. Deception and forgery were at the heart of the complex encounter between the antiquarian traditions of pre-Columbian Mexico and the nascent antiquarianism of Renaissance Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Giuseppe. And Now we have Emily Neumeier, or Neumeier. I didn't ask you how you pronounce it yourself.
I say Neumeier.
Neumeier, who's going to talk about an Albanian vizier's claim to antiquity in Ottoman Greece. Thank you.
How do I? Oh. Good. So I'd like to join my colleagues in thanking our organizers, Ben and Felipe. And I'll be winding our discussion down today with of entangled traditions of antiquity by taking us back east to the Eastern Mediterranean, and more specifically to Greece. In the winter of 1812, the Danish antiquarian Peter Bronsted was winding down his tour in the Peloponnese, which of course at this time was still part of the Ottoman Empire. The Greek Revolution would only come a decade later in 1821. Bronsted, along with a handful of other European travelers, had joined forces to conduct the first expedition to the great temple of Apollo Epicurus in Bassae, and after several months of measuring the proportions of the temple and digging in search of architectural sculpture, he was finally on his way home. Yet, Bronsted resolved that before leaving the shores of Hellas once and for all, he should first pay a visit to the great Ottoman vizier to the north, the notorious Ali Pasha of Yanina. Under his almost 40-year tenure as the governor of multiple sub-provinces, Ali Pasha held firm control over what is now southern Albania in northern Greece. In a later account of his travels, Bronsted explained that he was curious to meet a man whose exploits were one of the principal themes of the popular songs, which I often heard in almost all of the provinces. Ali Pasha's reputation was so far-reaching that one of Bronsted's colleagues working at the Apollo Temple recorded one of these popular Greek folk songs about the Ottoman vizier in the final publication of the Bassae expedition. A note in the volume mentions that the workers from the local village often sang the tune as they labored to uncover the stones from the temple. The lyrics of the folk ballad, which affirm Ali Pasha's status as a veritable pop icon during his own time, appears in the text alongside lithograph plates of the ground plans and sculptural friezes from the temple. The excavators were clearly aware that, as they busied themselves unearthing monumental warriors locked in eternal combat, they stood in the midst of a modern mythmaker. The expedition to the Apollo Temple, as well as other antiquarian efforts such as Stuart and Rivette's Antiquities of Athens, have come to define our understanding of Europe's rediscovery of Greece, as well as the birth of modern archaeology. Today I seek to introduce Ali Pasha as a notable local figure who is equally engaged in this scramble for antiquity, mobilizing the past for securing his own political legacy in the region by engaging both European travelers as well as the intellectual elites at his own court in Yanina. Ali Pasha was certainly not shy about putting Bronsted to work, excavating ancient ruins within his own territory. In the end, Bronsted fulfilled his wish to meet the vizier in person and found Ali Pasha in his port city of Preveza. During their meeting, Ali Pasha invited Bronsted to join a short scientific excursion that he was organizing to some nearby ruins located just outside the city. These ruins were the remains of Nicopoli, the ancient Roman city founded by Octavian, the later Augustus, to commemorate his naval victory over Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium. The significance of Nicopoli as a historical site must have intrigued Bronsted, but after almost 7 years of constant travel, he preferred to depart immediately and press on for home. Despite these demurrals, Ali Pasha proved to be quite persuasive on the matter, and in the end, Bronsted reluctantly agreed to the proposal. Several days later, Bronsted found himself practically being frog-marched out to the site with the Pasha in his richly adorned carriage, accompanied by 100 guards. Once there, Ali Pasha made himself comfortable in a farmer's hut that had been refitted with splendid cushions and nargile pipes. Before their work for the day, which would ultimately involve unearthing some large slabs of marble pavement from one of the site's temples, the Pasha first asked Bronsted to relate everything that he knew about this ancient city. Once Bronsted had finished rehearsing the history of Nikopoli, Ali Pasha nodded and replied that he had already been acquainted with everything Bronsted had just stated and had merely questioned him on the subject to compare his account with that which an Englishman had given Ali Pasha some time before. And I think it's really important to note here that my colleagues have been highlighting a dynamic with European antiquarians and local informants, but in this case, we really have an inversion of that dynamic where we have a local antiquarian and European informants. Ali Pasha then voiced his astonishment at the Franks, at the extremity of the world, were so well acquainted with his countries and his cities. Bronsted reports this last comment with a degree of smugness, mentioning in an aside that he had become accustomed to locals expressing their amazement at his knowledge of the region, a thing which often happens to us with the Turks. Yet, in what Bronsted assumes to be a transparent expression of Ali Pasha's admiration, it is also easy to hear a gentle teasing or mocking tone as well. It is important to keep in mind that at the beginning of the 19th century, long-distance travel still entailed a great deal of adversity. When Bronsted had first arrived in Greece several years earlier, he himself was shipwrecked off the shore of Corfu, where he was then confined for a month due to illness. By emphasizing how far Bronsted had trekked to visit his territory, Ali Pasha betrays some confusion about why a Western European would spend such a great deal of time learning the history of a country that was not his own, and then leave behind all the security of friends and family to seek out old ruins. The British architect and archaeologist Charles Cockerell, who coincidentally was also one of Bronsted's colleagues working at the Apollo Temple, relates that at his own meeting with Ali Pasha in Yanina, the governor asked him if he had a family back home in England, and upon hearing that he was an only child, exclaimed that it was a sin that he should leave his mother. Why did he not stay at home? Ali Pasha's combined fascination and incredulity about the Franks who came from the extremity of the world highlights the complexity of the various cross-cultural encounters and exchanges that were taking place due to the opening up of Greece to the west. The zenith of Ali Pasha's career in the early 19th century coincided with an increased flow of Western European travelers in the regions largely under his control. Once deterred by the difficulties of traveling unhindered within Ottoman lands, these groups of men found their way to Greece and Albania as part of their grand tour, once the Napoleonic Wars effectively closed Italy and spurred them to seek new regions to explore. At the same time, there was also a growing interest in the classical past among local Christian elites at the court in Yanina, proponents of the so-called Greek Enlightenment. With many of these elites having traveled abroad in their youth and educated in intellectual centers such as Venice and Vienna, they had brought back with them the conviction that a well-rounded individual should be versed in the texts of ancient authors. While participating in a Europe-wide phenomenon, these elites were also aware that they were in some way specially positioned to receive the ancient authors, as they hailed from the lands within the geographic domains of ancient Greece and Rome. While Ali Pasha did not fully appreciate the personal motivations of an antiquarian like Bronsted or Cockerell, he still understood that change was in the air, and that he could utilize knowledge gleaned from Western travelers to promote himself to the cultural milieu in his own region. Within Ottoman Greece, how did locals, both Muslim and Christian alike, claim antiquity for themselves? Let me attempt to answer this question by first turning our attention to a little-known Greek inscription that commemorates Ali Pasha's reconstruction of the walls of Yanina in 1815. The epigraphic inscription, consisting of 20 lines arranged in rhyming couplets, narrates the long history of the city walls. Although a section from the top portion of the plaque is now lost, the fragmentary text that remains indicates that the inscription begins with the initial construction of the city in ancient times, and then goes on to highlight the ineptitude of later rulers when the fortification walls inevitably required maintenance and repair. As the former despots pled and always asked for innovation, and though in many centuries past, and with them many consuls and rulers, none could take up the responsibility and prove themselves beneficial to this country, and despite all the many years that passed, failed to lay down a single stone. The inscription, having justified the urgent need for a restoration and modernization of the city walls, continues, referring to Ali Pasha as the Vizier of Epirus, the renowned descendant of Pyrrhus the Marvelous. Pyrrhus, of course, is the great Hellenistic king of this region, who we remember today with the phrase a Pyrrhic victory. The inscription continues, another wondrous flame, Ali Pasha brings the city back to life and restores the walls, as beautiful as ever, thus creating a sophisticated pun between the word here used for flame, pyr, and Pyrrhus. Thus, Ali Pasha is another flame, another Pyrrhus, who, through his cleansing abilities, tears down the older city fabric, only to construct it again anew. I should note that this inscription is in Greek, that the fact that it's in Greek verse makes it extraordinary within the wider Ottoman context, as by this point there was already a rather developed decorum of what could and should be included in a public inscription. So at this time period, within this region and throughout the empire, an inscription would be in Ottoman Turkish, so it would be an Arabic script. It should begin and end with the Sultan, and in many cases it would include the monogram of the Sultan, the Tura. And as you can see here, there's none of that. So this is really quite a special case. Rather, we can understand this inscription as a unique product of Ali Pasha's domain, as well as his power base in court. The artist William Haygarth, who spent a few weeks in Yanina in 1810, had this to say about the elites of Ali Pasha's court. The society is more civilized than in any other town of Greece. The Pasha, though illiterate himself, is fond of conversing with learned men, and keeps them constantly about his person. Ali left Yanina before my departure and crossed the Pindus with a considerable body of troops in order to have an interview with his son in Thessaly. I overtook him in Trichala and found that he had brought all of the literati of his capital with him, though he intended to be absent only a very short time. It's equally important to note, however, that in Yanina, references to antiquity extended beyond these more elite court circles. In a popular folk song contemporary to the time of Ali Pasha, which was later recorded by a French ethnographer, he is hailed as the hero of Epirus, awesome and terrible, the imitator of Pyrrhus, o mimetis tu Pyrrhus, so the one who performs mimesis. The specific language used here and in the public inscription as well to proclaim Ali Pasha as the literal descendant as well as the present embodiment of Pyrrhus works as a rhetorical device that conjures both a cyclical and linear view of ancient history. We will spend the rest of this presentation focusing on what I believe is another important case of Ottoman antiquarianism. We return back to Nicopoli, where Ali Pasha, I argue, constructed a palace to mark the place where he had routed Napoleon in a battle on the site. I argue that this palace was intentionally located directly on top of the place where Augustus had almost 2,000 years ago, before Ali Pasha's time, constructed his own monument to commemorate his triumph at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. So just briefly here, just note where the camp of Octavian is. It's slightly north of where, it's on a hill where Nicopoli would have later been built. Several years after the battle, on the northern side of this new city, the emperor constructed a large monumental complex that served as the official memorial for this victory atop the hill where Augustus had established his camp and watched the sea battle. By the end of the 18th century, Nicopoli, including the Actium monument, had become an archaeological ruin. But in 1798, the ancient city again became the site for an important military incursion. Upon the collapse of the Venetian Republic, French forces entered and occupied the formerly Venetian-controlled areas on the Greek mainland, including Preveza and Nicopoli. War broke out between the French and the Ottoman Empire, and this was Ali Pasha's opportunity to invade Preveza on behalf of the Sultan. In order to reach the port, Ali Pasha's troops had to face the French redoubts and trenches thrown up on the site of Nicopoli, and on October 12, 1798, thousands of Ali Pasha's soldiers succeeded in overwhelming the combined French and insurgent Greek forces. In order to commemorate this victory, Ali Pasha later arranged to have a palace erected on the hill north of the city, where he had set up his own tent to watch the defeat of Napoleon's soldiers below. Although the structure no longer stands, it seems that it was erected directly on top of the ancient Actium monument. Although it is clear that in the early modern period, locals were fully aware that the ruins at Nicopoli indicated the presence of a large ancient city, the 17th century Ottoman traveler Evliya Çelebi, for example, relates that a Roman emperor brought 1,000 ships to this place. Whether Ali Pasha knew specifically about the monument to Augustus when he first planned his offensive against the French remains unlikely. Yet, surely after the Battle of Nicopoli, what had been a practical strategic decision, taking the high ground, became an opportunity for drawing a connection between Ali Pasha's victory against Napoleon and the triumph of Augustus at Actium, arguably one of the most famous military battles in ancient Rome. Ali Pasha mentioned to Bronsted that he had already learned about the ancient history of Nicopoli from an earlier English traveler, and he's most likely making a reference to William Martin Leake, who visited the site in 1804. Contemporary archaeologists credit Leake with the discovery of the Augustan monument. And in this map, which is included as a travel account, he's labeled it as the Temple of Apollo. Leake read the ancient authors who described this monument, such as Strabo or Suetonius, and realized this hill had to be the site for the Actium Memorial. It is plausible that once Leake had explained the significance of this particular site to Ali Pasha, 6 years after the Battle of Nicopoli, the governor arranged to have his own construction mark the place where two ambitious young leaders, separated by almost 2 millennia, both had observed their fate unfold in the land and sea below. By the time the British traveler Thomas Hughes visited the site in 1813, Ali Pasha had already built his palace, labeled here as number 8 on the map. In his account, Hughes reports that behind the theater, upon one of the highest peaks of the northern range of hills, stands a small serai belonging to the vizier, built upon the spot where he fixed his tent to observe the Battle of Nicopoli, when his eldest son Mukhtar Pasha routed the French and Prevezans at the head of this Albanian cavalry. The same spot is assigned by many intelligent travelers to the tent of Augustus before his battle of Actium, and there he built an open-air edifice to Apollo. From an archaeological perspective, it is entirely probable that the palace would have stood directly above the ancient site, as its foundations were cut into the very side of the hill, and once covered over with earth, would have created a convenient flat platform upon which Ali Pasha could build. Unfortunately, no trace of the early 19th century palace survives. Recent excavations and ethnography research has revealed that this site was looted during World War II, when Italian soldiers had locals smash stone blocks on the hill in order to construct guardhouses. So that's probably where the palace went. However, I believe that we can catch a rare glimpse of this palace in another drawing by Haygarth, with the house of Ali Pasha standing sentinel over the ancient city, and it's to your left. We also get another perspective of this place from the land registers located in the State Ottoman Archives in Istanbul, which note that the structure was a center for the thriving agricultural holdings that Ali Pasha acquired upon his conquest of the area. Amidst the ruins of Augustus' city of victory, the fields had come alive with farmsteads yielding an abundance of produce for the surrounding region and the newly acquired port of Preveza. This palace on the hill was both a beacon of a centralized agroeconomic regime, as well as a lieu de mémoire that reminded visitors of Ali Pasha and Augustus and their profound connection across time, a coincidence so uncanny it could only be explained by the force of destiny. In conclusion, my investigation of Ali Pasha's antiquarian has been inspired by a recent movement in Ottoman studies where scholars, in their exploration of institutions such as the Imperial Archaeology Museum in Istanbul, which continues to serve in its function today, interrogates the notion that classical and Near Eastern archaeology was a European invention imposed on a latent Ottoman population. Yet such academic interventions, primarily focusing on the late 19th century, still must ultimately grapple with the Ottoman bureaucrats in Istanbul and their palpable anxiety about catching up with Western European movements. What is so fascinating about Ali Pasha's interest in antiquities almost a century earlier, in the early 1800s, is the complete absence of this anxiety, and in fact a sense of ownership and entitlement to the material located within the territory that he controlled. When Ali Pasha first met Peter Bronsted in Preveza, he asked if the Danish archaeologist was one of those milords whom he had heard had been excavating in the Peloponnese. When Bronsted affirmed that this was indeed the case, Ali Pasha was ready with a proposal of his own. My son wrote to me of the marbles he found in the Morea. I myself also have some old stones in this country. I have, moreover, a good many, and if you have a mind to excavate some part of Albania, I will furnish you with as many people as you wish for nothing. But it is to be understood that I will have my share of the marbles and precious things that we find. Bronsted ultimately declined this request. Unfortunately, it would be fascinating. But what this moment reveals is that, in regards to the classical past, Ali Pasha exemplifies an Ottoman official that was fully in control of exploiting the political, monetary, and cultural capital that could be gained by forging his own connections with local ancient heroes, embodied in the material fragments on the ground. While colluding with European archaeologists and seeking the expertise of Greek Enlightenment scholars in his own court, Ali Pasha, an Albanian Muslim, and is positioning himself as the rightful heir to the region's historical past, offers an intriguing vision of modern identity alternative to European Philhellenism or Greek nationalism at a time when these movements were in their formative stages. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, those were three very interesting papers, and I'm sure there'll be lots of entangled questions.
Thank you so much for this wonderful paper. I wonder, do you really think that, I mean, so much was done even before Ali Pasha in terms of this sort of Philhellenism. It wasn't really, as far as my understanding goes, he wasn't, I mean, we have a lot of stuff going on in the 18th century too. I guess maybe people focus more on the 19th century because the Grand Tour really gets going.
Yes.
But in the 18th century, I mean, after you have the Orloff Revolt, for example, in the Morea and the Peloponnese, and then that's in the 1770s, and already then Greeks see how much the Franks like this kind of business and start naming their mercantile ships after ancient heroes and things like that to sort of start fomenting support. I mean, I'm just wondering, how aware do you think he was of the way that the past was already being actively kind of manipulated to please the Philhellenes in the prior decades?
It's a great question. In Yanis Hamilakis' book, he actually cites another travel account. It's actually, it's not a travel account, it's just sort of this apocryphal story that Ali Pasha, there was sort of, these revolutionary groups around, and this is the so-called Society of Friends, right? And there was supposed to be sort of a branch in Yanina. And Ali Pasha was supposed to say to one of the members, what's going on in Athens? You're not naming your kids after, Yanis or Yorgos. You're naming them, Pericles and and Achilles. So what's going on there? So he actually cites this as sort of Ali Pasha as sort of this figure, sort of sensing that something was up, and he was wanted to get to the bottom of it. So that's an apocryphal story, but
yeah, I guess I'm asking, that's really interesting, how much he sort of was doing his own thing organically, or how much he was doing his own thing in response to what he saw going on elsewhere in Greece.
I think it's clear that he's doing it's clear that he's definitely responding to an interest that he's seeing in other parts of Greece. But I think I would really like to emphasize that, the Greeks in Yanina versus the Greeks in Athens versus the Greeks in the Peloponnese, I really feel that there are these different groups of people with different motivations. And I need to tease this out a little bit more, but I really do think that he's mostly responding to the people of Yanina, who I'm not terribly convinced that around 1800 that they really have necessarily revolutionary intent, but they're still interested in, have a lot of curiosity in pursuing antiquarian activities to form their own identity or whatnot. So I don't necessarily want to imply that there are these sort of same political intent is going on with all of these different groups of Christians in Ottoman Greece at this point. Yeah.
My question for Byron. Your final passage brought home to me, and I think this was very much then reinforced by Giuseppe's entire presentation, the importance of thinking about secrecy, and in terms of when we talk about the dialogue between antiquities, or antiquarianisms, the role that secrecy plays, the role of what's not disclosed plays. And I'm curious if there's ways in your text that we can get sort of either through elliptical references or through sort of an attention to what's absent from the text, and other alternative antiquarianisms that aren't recorded in the more conventional ways.
Well, very interesting question. The most obvious, actually, if you want to triangulate a set of sources, we've got these relaciones, which are kingly interviews, kingly decreed, what the second wants these collected, and we've got the Motolinia texts, which are Franciscan authored accounts. The third thing to sort of triangulate would be actually Inquisition documents. And in fact, many of the themes in Inquisition documents parallel precisely examples of Motolinia that, like in the Yucatan, Diego de Landa is torturing Maya so that they will confess their errors, and he reports that not only do they go to ancient sites to dig up objects to turn in, which were actually not part of their present circulation, but fears that they're actually making new objects as well to have things to hand in. With the question about sort of old and corrupt images that came up in Motolinia, basically about the same time Motolinia is writing. In Oaxaca, we've got a big idolatry investigation going on, and there again it said, this is 1546, it said that 6 years earlier, Dominican had a big idol collection campaign. They turned over the images that were basically corrupt, old images no longer in use, but that the key images that were still beautiful and the most precious devils in the entire area, those had been kept for several years afterwards. So I'd say, of course, in some ways I think Inquisition trials are a place where it's much easier to see, since you've got lots of witnesses who have their own very clear agendas, and those are sort of contexts where we can see more the precise questions of secrecy and stuff being revealed that shouldn't be revealed. With the relaciones, this is an interesting question. The relaciones are also weird because they're not as religiously charged situations. It's usually like local landlords and local Spanish political figures who are working on these in collaboration with their indigenous elite allies, right? So there's a very different type of dialogue, I think, going on in these documents than in the Franciscan ones and in Inquisition trials. So that doesn't tell you if I can think of good examples of secrecy in these documents, but perhaps talking about why there's sort of less paranoia or whatever, they're less kind of charged documents. That's kind of how I would answer that.
Marley.
So thank you for these papers. One of the themes that I'm kind of interested in here is the misunderstandings and the exchanges between these ideas, and I think Byron's paper got closest to it, although I'd welcome your thoughts on this as well. But what sort of work these ideas are doing in a broader sense, right? So like if we think about the inscription up there, people are walking through this, right? And are probably reading it or not reading it, as it may be, and having their own receptions on it, right? Like the Faith Codex was, you know, an attempt to control information. So I guess, is there any, to the other two, is there any sense of how popular people, everyday people, are interacting with these ideas? If they're buying them, if they're rejecting them? Not so much in a sense of like agency for the people, but just in terms of what these ideas are doing in terms of the society beyond the immediate sphere of exchange sketched out.
Well, to address your question, that's one of the reasons I brought up the folk song, is because, you know, that this is always a problem you have with inscriptions, right? Is, you know, especially learned one like this one. I mean, this is not Demotic Greek. I mean, it's a very sophisticated. The language of the poem is extremely sophisticated. Doesn't have any Ottoman. The Greek of this period is really inflected with Turkish. So sometimes you would see that, and there's nothing like that there except the word vizier. But it's interesting actually that you see evidence in the travel accounts that, you know, there was a way to sort of read text in that it would what it meant was transferred orally, right? So somebody knew what it said, and then they told someone else, and then of course people take great interest in something like this. So we get another example of another inscription that Ali Pasha commissioned in Greek. We get several travelers who go out there to go look at it, and their travel guides can convey to them, you know, paraphrase what it means. So, you know, even if you couldn't read it line by line, sort of the general collective knew what it said. So there's this sort of, that's going on. But I think also the folk poem is, the folk song is really important to and that's not in a very high Greek, that has a lot of Turkish and Albanian words in it. But even so, this idea of Ali Pasha as the Pyrrhus of Yanina, as the great, you know, the embodiment of the local Greek king, has trickled down into popular folk sung tradition. And I actually think these songs are a really important and untapped way to kind of access the questions you're asking in terms of, you know, what did regular people think? But it's clear that this idea was getting purchased sort of in a wider scale. So yeah, thank you for your question.
I've got a question. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no,
Are you going to respond to that question? Because you might well have things to say.
It's not very easy for me to give an answer this about, starting from my sources. So I have to think a little bit about, but I will try to. Let's have a talk later, because I have not a quick answer now. Sorry.
Could I take the liberty of abusing my privilege to ask Giuseppe a question? I mean, the two conspicuous examples of antiquarianism in mid-16th century Mexico that stick in my mind. One involves another Italian hoaxer, the Sicilian Lucio Marineo, who, in fact found, or claimed to have found, a Roman coin in Darien. Now, there was obviously an agenda behind that wonderful find. Again, with Vinko Palantin, a Croatian Dominican, he claimed to have cracked the Mayan glyphs, and that they were in fact in the language of Punic, meaning by title, Carthage had fallen to the Romans so centuries after, as part of, the spearhead of the Holy Roman Empire. This demonstrated that Yucatan belonged to Spain. With Motolinia, I don't think those examples of antiquarianism are innocent curiosity. He finds fascinating things, but what do you think is driving the sort of investigations and things that you highlighted? Because to me, this isn't probably innocent antiquarianism.
And of course, it's not. I think that, well, surely Motolinia, more than justifying conquest, is justifying a process of evangelization. So we have to think all the work within this framework and also I didn't enter, this is not very known, but also some problems that are behind the passages in which he talks about some remains he find, etc., are within the Franciscan schema of the ages. There are a lot of intersection of this kind. I think that at least for I think that there are different levels. The final level, the one of Agnews, and I was mentioning the forgery, the open forgery, etc., of course is not innocent, this kind of interest. And here we have to, is a problem of reputation of the Franciscans, for me, this work he's doing. Curiously, by using a Dominican forger, but this is another matter. Because he's sending these passages on Agnews and all this rewriting of the early genealogies of the Mexican peoples are inserted in a version, in a draft of his writing that is sent to the Count of Benavente in the context of his polemics with Las Casas, in which he's trying to present his own version, his own idea of the right way to convert, etc., as reliable. So, while I think that the other evidences are more interesting, like when there are two levels. One is the attempt to really create antiquities, that is, to recognize European patterns in Mexican materials, like when he called coins, the cacao seeds, or these things. And here is also I think that is always something is about reputation a lot. It's about the reputation of the kind of writings he's doing and the audience he's addressing. I think this is very important in this. Then the other examples about tracing, that is a very complicated thing, of course, but I try to extract some examples, tracing possible examples, pieces of indigenous traditions, of course, in a very complex way. Of course, we have to deal with them in a very complex way. I think that what is interesting of these passages is that, with the exception of the box sent to Moctezuma, which is, of course, another kind of problem there, they are not intentional. There is not very clear. He is describing things, and then it emerges a reference to antiquity, to some. Also, what Byron was mentioning, the problem that then in the inquisitorial trials you find similar patterns. I agree, but what is interesting is that Modigliani is one of the early ones who's shaping the description, who's giving a kind of paradigm of the way in which the Indians are reacting, the way in which they are acting with votive objects in a way. So it's very complex, also considering that Modigliani had relations with the Inquisition at the very early stage of his permanence in Mexico. So my attempt now is more to try to complexify a little bit these very, very early texts that are at the beginning of the recognition of antiquarian attitudes, antiquities, and so to rethink more than.
Thank you. After my selfish question, we can probably just have time for one more, if anyone has. Well, that's very convenient. So, thank you. Did you?
Oh, well, I did have a question.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that I've been trying to think it through in my head, so I'm not sure if I'm going to articulate it well. But a number of these questions about religion have made me think about how we think about creating history versus perhaps uncovering it, and what the relationship between antiquarianism and the construction of religious histories around objects is. So we had the Kamashla example, where we have this god, that there's this statue of a god they're saying is very old, and these arrows. Or we have these examples in the Inca context in which they're destroying things in order to create history. And the Kamashla example in particular made me think of these St. Luke Madonnas, right? That are not, we know that these are sort of 13th century objects, but the story says that they're much earlier. And so the question that I think I'm trying to ask is, what is the relationship between a desire to uncover some sort of true history and a desire to create a new history? And my particular interest is in the religious context, but perhaps this question can expand beyond that as well.
I think no one had better answer that just now. But I think this is a sort of a good question that probably will be picked up later and definitely over lunch. But thank you for that. That was.
Yeah, thank you everybody. We'll start again at 2:40, so in an hour. And the speakers should stay here. We have food for lunch for the speakers and moderators.